In 1940, the Third Reich seemed like an invincible colossus, dominating vast stretches of Europe with its relentless military machinery. However, just 5 years later, that same force crumbled, leading to defeat. How did this radical transformation occur? What strategic decisions, born of arrogance and overconfidence, led to the downfall of one of the most feared regimes in history? Join us in this analysis as we break down the fatal mistakes that sealed the fate of Nazism. Operation Barbarossa, the collapse of the Nazi Empire in the cold Soviet lands. On June 22, 1941, the sun rose over Europe, and with it one of the most fateful episodes in history. Hitler, with blind confidence in his war machine, launched the largest military operation ever seen, the codename Barbarossa. The objective, the conquest of the Soviet Union. Over 3 million soldiers marched, convinced that a swift victory awaited them. But what they didn't know was that on that day, Germany had sealed its fate. The Wehrmacht advanced relentlessly, like a storm sweeping everything in its path. Cities fell, villages burned, and miles of steppe swallowed the German divisions. Victory seemed inevitable. But what Hitler had not foreseen was the tenacity of his enemy, nor the brutality of nature. The supply lines stretched like serpents across an immense and hostile territory. Soon, what had been a glorious advance turned into a desperate struggle. Fuel was scarce, ammunition was running out, and the worst was yet to come, the unforgiving Russian winter. The winter fell like a scythe upon the German troops. Temperatures plummeted, freezing bodies, machines, and spirits. There was no shelter. There was no escape. The Wehrmacht, without adequate clothing or supplies, was struck by the greatest enemy of all, the cold. Soldiers froze to death in their positions, their bodies rigid like statues on a battlefield that showed no mercy. And then, Stalingrad. Here, in the ruins of a devastated city, the Nazi forces met their doom. Trapped, surrounded by the Red Army with no chance of escape, Hitler, stubborn as ever, refused to allow a retreat. He believed that victory was still possible. But the reality was different. The German Sixth Army was destroyed, completely annihilated in one of the bloodiest battles in history. Barbarossa, which began as an unstoppable assault, ended up being the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, a strategic miscalculation that cost millions of lives and permanently weakened the German military might. The dream of conquering the East vanished in the ice of the Soviet steppes, and with it the hopes of a German victory. The strategic error that sealed Nazi destiny, the declaration of war on the United States. December 1941. In the Pacific, the calm was shattered by the roar of bombs. The attack on Pearl Harbor, carried out by Japan, unleashed a wave of destruction and fury. But what happened next would change the course of the war forever. Hitler, watching from Europe, saw an opportunity and made one of his greatest mistakes. Although he was not obligated by his pact with Japan, Hitler made a decision that defied all strategic logic. He declared war on the United States. In an act of arrogance and disdain, the Führer believed that the young American nation, already embroiled in conflicts in the Pacific, would not pose a significant threat to the Third Reich. But Hitler underestimated his new enemy. The United States, with its vast industrial power, its inexhaustible production capacity, and millions of men ready to fight, did not sit idle. Within months, American factories roared in unison, churning out tanks, planes, and ships at a pace Germany could never match. Hitler's decision unleashed a storm the Nazis could not stop. With the entry of the United States into the conflict, Germany now faced an enemy that could fight in 2 oceans and on multiple fronts. American resources began to fuel the Allied war machine, supplying weapons, equipment, and fresh troops that would soon flood the European battlefields. This was the strategic mistake Hitler could never reverse. By declaring war on the United States, he sealed the fate of his own empire. The Nazi forces, already worn down by fighting in the East, now had to contend with the economic and military might of an unrelenting nation. An enemy that would not rest until the complete collapse of the Third Reich. The storm that unleashed the fall of the Third Reich. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The decisive moment of World War II had arrived. In the early hours of the day, over 150,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel to assault the heavily fortified beaches of Normandy. The invasion that would change the course of the war was underway, but the German High Command, led by Hitler, made a strategic blunder that would doom them. Hitler was convinced that the main landing would occur at Calais, the narrowest point between England and France. There, elite troops and German armoured divisions were concentrated, ready to repel any attack. However, the Allies launched their offensive in Normandy, a region the Nazis considered less likely for an assault of such magnitude. Despite fierce German resistance on the beaches, the Allies had overwhelming strength, air and naval superiority, along with meticulous planning. Meanwhile, the German armoured divisions, which could have reinforced the defence in Normandy, remained inactive further north in Calais due to Hitler's strict order not to move them without his direct authorization. This delay proved fatal. As the Allies gained ground, the German command's coordination errors and confused communications became evident. The late response and lack of reinforcements allowed the Allies to consolidate their positions, and soon Allied troops began expanding throughout Normandy. The German failure to correctly anticipate the landing site allowed the Allies to open a new front in Western Europe. From Normandy, Allied forces quickly liberated key cities in France and began pushing toward the heart of Germany. The Third Reich, which once seemed invulnerable, was now facing an unstoppable enemy advancing on all fronts. D-Day not only marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich, but it was a strategic blow from which it would never recover. Hitler's mistake in underestimating the invasion at Normandy opened a breach that allowed the Allies to liberate Western Europe and move toward the final destruction of the Nazi regime. The illusion of miracle weapons, how Hitler's dream destroyed Germany. Another of the Third Reich's fatal mistakes was Hitler's obsession with the so-called wonder weapons. From the V-2 rockets to the imposing Tiger heavy tanks and innovative jet aircraft, the Nazi regime believed that these technological marvels would turn the tide of the war. While these advances were indeed impressive and demonstrated Nazi Germany's technical prowess, their ultimate impact on the war's outcome was limited. Instead of focusing on the mass production of more practical and effective equipment, such as medium tanks and fighters, Hitler directed valuable resources to ambitious projects that, although promising, failed to shift the balance of the conflict. This approach weakened Germany's conventional military capabilities. While Hitler dreamt of these wonder weapons, the Allies, with a more pragmatic strategy, were mass-producing weaponry that was more effective and suited to battlefield needs. With a focus on quantity and practicality, the Allies outproduced the Nazis, who became bogged down in their pursuit of advanced technology. Hitler's obsession with wonder weapons became a fatal distraction. As the Allies advanced with strength and efficiency, Germany found itself increasingly isolated, relying on technological dreams rather than the realities of combat. This diversion of resources and priorities marked yet another step toward the downfall of the Third Reich. The Führer in the Abyss, the tragedy of autocratic leadership that sealed Germany's fate. Finally, we cannot ignore the greatest mistake of all, Hitler himself. Throughout the war, his leadership became a deadly trap for the Third Reich. Hitler made crucial military decisions without listening to his generals, imposing flawed tactics and ignoring strategic advice from his own experts. His obsession with controlling every aspect of the conflict led him to reject vital suggestions, often resulting in disasters on the battlefield. The most devastating example of his obstinacy was his refusal to allow the retreat from Stalingrad. As the German Sixth Army found itself surrounded and facing imminent annihilation, Hitler refused to order a strategic withdrawal. This decision, rooted in his ego and need to demonstrate power, led to the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives and the destruction of one of Germany's elite forces. Hitler's autocratic leadership not only resulted in the loss of this crucial battle, but also squandered strategic opportunities that might have prolonged the war or even altered its course. Each wrong decision added to the downfall of the Third Reich, trapping Germany in a cycle of disaster. Ultimately, Hitler's authoritarian leadership was a decisive factor in Germany's defeat. His inability to listen, learn, and adapt to the realities of the conflict sealed the fate of an empire that had aspired to dominate the world.